the quality of the resource declines, and also the energy return on the energy invested declines. It takes energy to explore for, drill, pump oil. Well, you know, we're facing the convergence of two crises. First, the problem with oil that we've been talking about, but at the same time, we're also at a situation of peak debt. I think we will learn that the world has limits, and that the highest human good comes not from getting more stuff and controlling other people, but from serving one another and from fitting in to the way nature works. The price of oil goes up above $100 a barrel and stays there for very long. That tends to undercut economic growth. So one way or another, we're in a situation where oil just isn't able to provide the economic bang that it used to. That's right. Maybe you've had the experience of running out of gas in your car, having to push your car, let's say 10 feet off to the side of the road. Okay, now imagine pushing your car 30 miles. How much work is that? Well, it's a lot. It's maybe 8 weeks of hard labor. But we get that done for us, having our car push 30 miles by a single gallon of gasoline for which we're paying $4 and complaining.
Is our civilization doomed as global oil production reaches its final chapter? That's a question we will try to answer in today's discussion with Richard Heinberg, who joins us from California. Welcome to Project Civilization.
Thanks, good to be with you.
So Richard, before we start, I'll just give our audience a quick introduction as to who you are. Richard is an American journalist and author of over 10 books, including The Party's Over, Oil, War and the Fate of Industrial Societies, The End of Growth, Adapting to Our New Economic Reality, and Peak Everything, Waking Up to a Century of Declines. Richard has also appeared in several documentaries, including the 2007 movie The Crude Awakening, and these days Richard is a fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute, which I will put a link to in the description below. Now, the main issue surrounding the predicament our civilization is facing is in a phrase known as peak oil. Now, I first discovered what peak oil meant back in 2007 when I read the late Matthew Simmons' book, Twilight in the Desert. That was incidentally the same year I discovered how fiat currencies worked whilst at university, and I had yet another shock after reading up on the subject of climate change in Tim Flannery's book, The Weathermakers. So 2007 was a very sobering year for me, and I haven't really been the same ever since. So to kick off this interview, we'll first of all start with a definition of what peak oil is. Now, in Australia, the term peak oil isn't very common in the political vernacular. In fact, here's what our former Prime Minister Tony Abbott once said about his understanding of peak oil.
It's not a term I have heard. Perhaps Robert knows about peak oil. He's the expert on arcane concepts. Maybe you can explain it to us, Robert.
Well, it's a concept which is concerned with the point at which oil production is beginning to decline.
So, Richard, can you enlighten our audience with a better definition of what peak oil is and what it isn't?
Well, peak oil is the phenomenon, the inevitable phenomenon of the peaking and decline of the rate of extraction of petroleum or oil from the ground. Oil is a non-renewable resource, and therefore we know that we can't continually extract more and more amounts. At some point it'll become too difficult or expensive, or both, to continue extracting more, so the rate at which we're producing it will reach a maximum and decline. The big question, of course, is when that point happens, because if we're not prepared for it, if we haven't found substitutes for oil, then this could pose an enormous threat to the global economy, because oil is our principal energy source. It's virtually all transport energy. And energy is what enables us to do what we do. as a modern industrial society. So if we're not prepared for peak oil, it is likely to mean, the end of industrial civilization as we know it. Now back to the question of when it's going to happen. There's been a lot of speculation about that, and maybe we can talk a bit more about that. But it's not centuries from now. It's probably not even decades from now where we may be experiencing the peak oil phenomenon basically as we speak.
Tony Abbott, our former Prime Minister, once said that at higher oil prices, all sorts of technologies and uneconomical deposits like fracking suddenly become possible. So is this the simple answer to the problem? We're safe because our markets will sort out peak oil challenges automatically through technology and innovation?
Right. Well, we've been experimenting with that theory for the last 10 years now. Regular conventional oil production peaked around 2005. And that conventional oil was basically what fueled the 20th century. That, when I say conventional oil, I mean onshore deposits of regular petroleum. Now, since 2005, liquid fuels have increased in supply, but all of the increases come from unconventional sources like tar sands in Canada, like tight oil produced by hydrofracturing in the US, deep water oil. All of these are more costly to produce, have higher environmental risk attached, and require more technology. So that's why they're more expensive. So over the last 10 years, what we saw was oil prices rose pretty dramatically, from $30 a barrel up to over $100 a barrel in order to pay for this new marginal production. But the problem was that these higher oil prices, over $100 a barrel, proved to be a drag on the economy. So the global economy has gotten very weak and soft over the last decade, partly as a result of chronically high oil prices. Now, even more recently, just the last couple of years, what's happened is that this economic weakness has depressed demand to the point that oil prices have fallen. Of course, the other thing that happened was that U.S. tight oil production really took off. And that's a little bit more complicated story. But with higher production of tight oil in the U.S. and tar sands in Canada, and a weaker global economy, the bottom fell out of the oil price, and oil prices collapsed to under $30 a barrel. They're now back up to a little under $50 a barrel, but that's not high enough to subsidize these unconventional sources. Again, deep water oil, tar sands, and tight oil. So most of the energy producers who are relying on these unconventional methods, well, I said most, it's actually all of them, are experiencing basically slow or fast motion bankruptcy. They're about 60% of the smaller companies are already bankrupt. The others are in the process of buying each other up, or taking on more debt so they can stay in the game a little bit longer. But it's basically a bloodbath in the oil industry. So there's no longer an oil price that works for both producers and consumers. It used to be that a price of $20 a barrel would be fine for producers. They'd make a profit, and consumers, that was cheap enough for consumers so that everybody could drive and be happy, and airlines were fine with it and so on. But that just doesn't work anymore. Now, even at $50 a barrel, it's not high enough to justify this new marginal production. And without the new marginal production, what we're going to see over the course of the next year or two is a steep drop in oil supplies. So one way or another, we're at this point, we're at this juncture where the oil industry just doesn't work anymore. And whether you call that peak oil or something else, it's something new. We've never seen this before.
So I guess it's very easy for most of us to get lost in the spectacle of modern day life. Skyscrapers, supermarkets, roads, cars, iPhones. But in fact, all of these modern world innovations have been that have been around us since the Industrial Revolution have been produced from ancient energy, especially oil, which up until now has been so plentiful and rich in uses that nothing's going to replace its volume either quickly or cheaply. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, before fossil fuels, we were living in basically agrarian societies. And most people were farmers because it took most people to produce enough of a surplus of food energy to support, 10 or 20% of the population to live in cities and specialize in other occupations. But what fossil fuels did, and especially oil, is provide new energy sources that were energy dense, that were portable, easily stored, that enabled us to invent all kinds of machines to replace human labor, especially in agriculture. So now instead of 75 or 80% of the population working at agriculture, we only need maybe 1% to do all of the farm work needed to feed everybody else. So that freed up all these people to do what? To move to cities and become the new middle class. We underwent the biggest demographic transition in all of human history as a result of fossil fuels. And we created a way of life that doesn't work without fossil fuels as far as we know. I mean, we want it to with alternative energy sources. We're trying to replace fossil fuels now, marginally at least, with solar and wind power, other renewables. But, we've got to, this is the project of the 21st century. This is the science experiment of the 21st century to see if we can replace fossil fuels with alternative energy sources fast enough and effectively enough to maintain something like our current way of life without, either succumbing to the economic turmoil of peak oil or the ecological catastrophe of climate change.
Yeah, I kind of think of the alternatives as being like hitting the brakes in a car travelling down a highway after an obstacle appears up in front. At those high speeds, it's simply too late for the brakes to save you from disaster. But moving along to remaining oil deposits, looking around the world, Richard, where are the majority of oil reserves left in sort of significant quantities?
Well, as I said earlier, the conventional oil that we've relied on is dwindling. This last year, oil discoveries were the smallest they've been in decades. That's partly because the oil industry is spending so little right now because they can't afford to because of low oil prices. But it's also because there isn't that much left to discover. There's still a lot of heavy oil in Venezuela. There's still a lot of tar sands in Canada. But again, these are expensive materials to extract and transform into a form that's usable by the aviation industry or the rest of the transport industry. So the Middle East still has a fair amount of conventional oil, but that's been systematically overestimated. The nations of the Middle East have been, of course, reporting to the rest of the world how much oil they have in reserve for decades now. And back in the 1980s, their reserves underwent a mysterious boost, a very dramatic boost, in some cases by doubling. And it's funny because at the time there wasn't much new exploration going on in the Middle East. So people who've looked into this have basically concluded that what the Middle East producers, who were all members of OPEC, what they were doing was competing for market share because OPEC allocates its production quotas depending on reserves. So if you have higher reserves, you get a higher production quota. Well, all these countries wanted higher production quotas, so they overstated their reserves to get them. And basically the rest of the world just took those numbers at face value and has done so ever since, because nobody is able to go to OPEC and do a third-party review of what their reserves actually are. So realistically, probably OPEC's reserves are at least a third less than what they're reporting to the rest of the world. So when we hear that, world oil reserves are, a couple of trillion barrels or whatever, first of all, you have to understand that a lot of that is tight oil or heavy oil that may never be produced because it'll be too expensive to get it out of the ground. And a lot of the rest of that is phantom barrels of oil that probably don't even exist because it's just due to over-reporting by OPEC.
So do you think it's likely that we're going to find any new significant oil deposits in the years to come?
Well, there's probably some oil in the Arctic. And of course, the oil companies view the melting of the Arctic sea ice with some pleasure, because that opens up a new exploration realm for them. But the Arctic is probably, for geological reasons, it's probably more gas prone than liquid prone in terms of deposits. So there may be large deposits of natural gas in the Arctic. Some oil deposits, no doubt, but getting those out from under a mile or two of ocean water and then getting them to market is not going to be an easy thing. Again, this is going to require very high oil prices to justify the effort. So unless oil prices go back to $120 a barrel, we're probably not going to see any Arctic oil actually appearing on the market.
So supposing we actually do find new oil reserves that are significant, ethically, do you think that we should even commence producing them? Because given climate change and taking into consideration the needs of future generations, maybe we shouldn't. Or do you think we should just spend it all and let future generations just fend for themselves?
Well, from an ethical standpoint, none of this is justified. Oil's a non-renewable resource. Every barrel that we pull out of the ground and burn once and for all is less that will be available to future generations. And I'm not talking necessarily about future generations who might want to fly coast to coast for a vacation, but we use fossil fuels for other things. We make fertilizers, we make chemicals of all kinds, plastics. If you're watching this on some kind of electronic device, it's made using fossil fuels, partly made from fossil fuels. All the parts were transported. The raw materials were mined using fossil fuels. So it's like, we're leaving nothing for our grandchildren, basically, through our policy of, burning the best stuff first and burning it as fast as we can. And then, as you mentioned, of course, there's the problem of climate change. The more we burn, the faster we burn it, the faster we alter the global climate to a situation where our grandchildren may not be able to survive anyway. So from an ethical standpoint, the only thing to do is to start weaning ourselves off of this stuff as fast as we possibly can. And we've known that for many years now. And yet the efforts to do this have been pretty paltry, really.
So looking to the way our economy works, as you well know, we live our lives on cheap energy, and we haven't accounted for expensive energy in the way that we've designed our cities to operate. In fact, we've designed our civilization around this notion that we'll never run out of anything. So, Richard, what will our modern world look like if the oil flow begins to rapidly decline?
You have to look at what we use oil for. And of course, most of it goes to transportation, but it's also essential to modern agriculture. So these are the two fields that would be impacted first and foremost by more expensive oil or by a decline in the rate of oil production, substantial decline. For transportation, of course, it would impact aviation. It would impact the economy as a whole, because people use gasoline to get to work, to go shopping, and so on. And so if they have to pay more for gasoline than they have left in their pockets for everything else, and in consumer economies, that if people are spending less money shopping and so on, then that makes the economy contract. So peak oil will ultimately mean economic contraction. Its implications for agriculture are perhaps even more severe, because farmers use oil to run their farm machinery. We, in general, in modern industrial societies, spend about 10 calories of fossil fuel energy to produce each calorie of food. Not all of that is in the farm. In fact, most of it is in processing, transport, and packaging, and so on. But the reality is, if oil becomes more scarce and or more expensive, then food is going to become more expensive. And we know that because every time in the past couple of decades when we've had an oil price spike, we've also seen a food price spike. So looking at a future of much more expensive food in the context of a failing economy is pretty scary. It means a lot of people aren't going to be able to afford to eat. And when that happens, historically, you get revolutions and all sorts of other social problems.
So you touched on timeframes before, but I've just got a few more questions on that. Shell Oil says that we run out completely by 2070, but isn't the real issue a reduction of, say, 5 or 10 million barrels per day from where we are now, which is around 85 million barrels a day?
Right. Yeah, people talk about peak oil as if it's about running out. That's not it at all. I mean, it's going to be decades before we actually run out of anything, in terms of non-renewable resources. But, that's a moot point. Our current civilization depends on us always having more of everything, and especially energy, because energy is the master resource. Energy is what enables us to extract other resources like metal ores and transform them. It's what enables us to produce food inexpensively enough and in large enough quantities to feed a growing population. So it's at the point where we stop having more that the problems start. And as you say, if we have 5 or 10% less, that's really, for a modern industrial economy like ours, that's a big problem indeed.
So in terms of alternatives to fossil fuels and oil, what kind of technologies do we currently have at our arsenal which could possibly replace oil?
Well, we have the possibility of electrifying as much transport as we can. There are already electric cars on the market. Some countries have a pretty large proportion of their rail system already running on electricity. And of course, electricity can be produced from renewable sources like solar and wind. So those are good things. And also rail is much more efficient at moving people and stuff than trucks or cars. We move a lot more stuff than we do people in terms of tonnage, quite dramatically so. So electric rail is a very good option for moving both people and stuff where it's available. Electric cars are okay, but they're an inherently inefficient way of moving people around. Much more efficient is any kind of public transportation. Of course, bicycles and walking are the most efficient ways of getting around. Aircraft, there's really no good substitute for kerosene-based jet fuels. Theoretically, we could run airplanes on sophisticated biofuels, but they would be very expensive and very inefficient to produce from an energy standpoint and also an environmental standpoint. For shipping, global shipping, and we move the great majority of our tonnage of stuff by ships. Without global shipping, of course, the whole project of globalization just doesn't work. For shipping, the only really good option is adding kite sails to improve the energy efficiency of shipping, and you could reduce the amount of bunker oil used in shipping by 60, maybe even 80% if all of the ships were fitted with kite sails. But still, they would have to burn oil for that other 20 to 40% of their motive power. So, altogether, there are options, but they're ones that are in some cases expensive, in some cases inefficient, and all of them will require substantial lead time. I mean, we can't deploy these alternative options overnight. In the case of electric cars, how many electric cars are there on the market today, much less on the roads? It'll take many decades to replace our current auto fleet with all electric vehicles. So, it's a theoretical solution, but it's not an immediately practical one.
So Donald Trump wants to actually bring manufacturing back to America. Do you think that that's more likely to happen just because we won't be able to deal with globalization and China making all our things? Because it sounds to me like what you're saying is it's just a lot easier to bring manufacturing back and not have to transport it over such a great distance in the first place.
Right. Well, it definitely makes sense to relocalize manufacturing and to localize our food systems to the greatest degree we can. And this is definitely what should be happening from a national policy standpoint. If this has to be done under duress, it's going to be pretty messy, because how do you move all of that manufacturing back over the course of 5 or 10 years, which is what might be required under a peak oil scenario? Where do you get the trained personnel? How do you set up all the factories that have been basically torn down and destroyed as a result of globalization? Who's going to pay for it all? And can we run all of those industrial processes without fossil fuels? There are a lot of high heat industrial processes used in metallurgy, making glass, making cement for concrete, that require very high temperatures, and achieving those temperatures without fossil fuels is going to be very difficult. So, yeah, it can be done, but realistically, what we're looking at is the shrinking of industrial societies, industrial economies, I should say, over the course of the next few decades. And this is what we should be planning for: relocalizing production, but also degrowing economies. And this is something that's being discussed in Europe by some, radical groups. They call themselves the degrowth movement. Nobody takes them seriously in the halls of governance, but these are the only people who are actually talking sense from the standpoint of our energy future.
So where are we today in terms of how much global renewable capacity we have installed already? Are we getting anywhere at all?
Well, yeah. I mean, in terms of the rate of growth of solar and wind capacity, it's pretty remarkable. If the current rate of growth in solar and wind were to continue, we could, in fact, have enough renewable energy in just a couple of decades. But the problem is, in order for that rate of growth to continue, we'll need really, really substantial new sources of investment capital. because right now these very high rates of growth are possible because these energy sources are starting from such a low initial rate of supply. It's easy to grow something by 50 or 100% if it's very small, but if it's very large, then doubling it is much more difficult. So as these renewable energy industries start to gain some size and some significant market share within the overall energy economy, maintaining the same rate of growth is going to be very difficult. But that's what we have to do in order to actually replace fossil fuels. Right now, just increasing solar and wind fast enough to replace fossil fuels in the electricity sector as it is going to be a big job. But the electricity sector is only a fairly small player in our overall energy markets. In the US, only about 20% of total energy is used in the form of electricity. So the other 80% is used for transportation, agriculture, home heating, heating water and buildings, all these other things. And so adapting our energy consumption to renewable energy is also going to be an enormous job. I mean, people who have natural gas stoves in their houses or heat their houses with natural gas, well, they're going to have to figure out how to do that with electricity, and then we have to supply electricity, not just the amount of electricity that we're using now, but the amount of electricity that we'll need in order to replace our use of fossil fuels in transport and in buildings and so on. This is an enormous job. This is, from an engineering perspective, we've never seen anything like this before.
Mm. You may have heard of Beyond Zero Emissions, which is a research and education organisation here in Australia.
Right. Yeah.
I actually met with them and a few politicians back in 2010, but basically their view is that Australia could have 100% renewable baseload electricity by having an oversupply of concentrated solar and wind assets to make up for the intermittency. So
right.
Do you believe that sounds halfway believable?
Well, yeah, intermittency is a big problem with solar and wind. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So what do you do about that? There are basically three solutions. One is storage, finding a way to store electricity, at least for a few hours, but better for longer periods, because with solar, you're dealing not only with diurnal intermittency, the sun not shining at night, but also seasonal intermittency. There may be weeks at a time when the sky is cloudy or the sun is very low on the horizon, and your solar electricity output is just way down or non-existent. So what do you do about that? Well, again, one of the solutions is storage, but that's very expensive. Even with new innovations in battery technology, the reality is that batteries are very expensive. You can store energy by pumping water uphill into reservoirs so that it can later flow back downhill, and you can capture that gravitational energy and send the water through turbines and turn it back into electricity. So there's storage. Then there's capacity redundancy, and that's what those folks you were talking with were talking about. You just build massively more energy production capacity than you actually need at any given moment, and you distribute it all over the place. So you're hoping that if the sun isn't shining in one place, it'll be shining someplace else. If the wind isn't blowing one place, it will be somewhere else, and you can make up for that by having all of these redundant sites interconnected. Yeah, that will work too, but again, it's expensive. Instead of just having to replace all of our current energy production capacity, you're talking about really doubling or tripling that in order to provide enough redundancy, if you were to deploy that as your only strategy. But the third strategy, which is the one that I'm most interested in, is also the cheapest, and that's demand management. Finding ways to just use a heck of a lot less energy and timing our energy usage to availability. So rather than just flipping on the light switch any old time, you have some way of knowing when electricity is available, and that's when you use it. You run the factory when there's electricity and you shut it down when there isn't. Now, from an economic standpoint, that's not how we like to operate. That's going to require some significant behavioral changes. But it's by far the cheapest of the three options. And realistically, I think it's the one we're going to have to deploy to the greatest degree.
Yeah, I think we've talked about that over here. It's they call it dumb grid versus smart grid, whereby appliances can talk to the power station. So if you turn on your dishwasher, for example, it won't just switch on. It'll flag itself to the power station that can then manage the load when it's appropriate, rather than just going on whenever it feels like it.
Right. Yeah, I've worked with a colleague at Post Carbon Institute, David Fridley, who's a staff scientist at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories in their energy analysis program, and we worked for the last year to look at renewable energy prospects, and we have a book coming out in just a couple of weeks called Our Renewable Future, which is basically a pretty close look at where we are with renewable energy and what will be required to get to an all renewable future. And our conclusion is really that it's mostly about changing the ways we use energy. It's also, of course, about just building a heck of a lot of solar panels and wind turbines, but that's not the real challenge. The real challenge is going to be changing energy demand.
Richard, you've had direct dealings with governments in the past, in the US to the Secretary of Energy and Peak Oil through the National Petroleum Council, and also in the European Parliament through the Committee on International Trade. So, Richard, how seriously are governments taking the peak oil issue at the moment, and what's being done?
I don't think they're taking it seriously at all. And the reason is that they're relying on very bad analysis and advice from places like the International Energy Agency and the U.S. Department of Energy and its Energy Information Administration. These agencies are taking, I think, a very naive look at future energy supplies, and they're not sounding the alarm as they should be doing. I mean, this is their job, to alert policymakers to our likely energy future and the energy constraints and problems that we're likely to face. And but it takes courage to tell people in power something they don't want to hear. And evidently these folks just rock the boat. Yeah, nobody wants to rock the boat. Evidently these people just don't have the courage to do it, because they're what they're doing, rather than showing realistic constraints to future supplies of oil and natural gas, for example, is just projecting past production trends to meet future demand trends. Well, anybody can do that. It doesn't. All you have to do is, draw some pretty graphs, and everybody looks at them and goes, "Sure, okay," and goes on about their business. And that's basically what's been happening.
So, moving along to our current economic system, as you know, we had a massive economic crash in 2008, which nearly brought down the entire global financial system. And then this is what happened.
I'm Matthew Lesko, and the government's giving away more money than ever before! $85 billion to help bank executives take a vacation! $25 billion to make cars that people don't want to buy! $600 billion to subsidize subprime lending practices that got us in this mess in the first place! Who cares about hyperinflation, crippling debt, or a massive tax burden on your grid?
So basically what happened was that rather than allowing the mistakes of banks and corporations to be resolved through write-offs and bankruptcy, the US government delayed the day of reckoning by printing vast amounts of money, Even our Australian banks had to be rescued and bailed out by the US Federal Reserve as part of the global $8 trillion bailout package, which most people don't even realise. But now the global debt is more than double what it previously was. The US Federal Reserve doesn't have any room on their balance sheet to pull that kind of stunt again. And globally, including Australia, interest rates are all on the march to zero and below. So although most people don't want to hear this, the whole entire global financial system will collapse within a few years, and assets like superannuation and real estate are going to plummet in value, and not just a little, a lot, possibly 70% or more, depending on how bad it gets. In a recent interview I had with Professor Steve Keen, he actually said that economics today is like living before the discovery of gravity in its own profession. So, Richard, what's your views on our current wonderful global economic system, which has now enslaved humanity into massive debts?
Well, I agree generally with Steve Keen. I think he's one of the most accurate observers of our current financial situation. We've used debt to solve lots of problems, but it's only a temporary solution, and debt creates its own future problems because it has to be repaid with interest. So it really only works with a growing economy. So we've banked everything on continuing economic growth, but guess what? We have a finite planet. You can't grow the economy continually on a finite planet because at the end of the day, economic growth means using more energy and materials. I know that lots of folks say, oh, we can grow the economy just by dematerialization. Somehow, we're going to be spending more money, but we won't actually be extracting more raw materials or using more energy. Well, you can shave off a little bit at the margins with efficiency, but realistically, if people have more money in their pockets, they're going to want to spend that on something that will tangibly benefit them, right? And that at the end of the day means more energy and materials. And again, on a finite planet, that just doesn't. Perpetual economic growth just doesn't work. At some point, we run out of fossil fuels. We run out of places to put solar panels and wind turbines. No matter how you configure it, the economy has to, at some point, either reach a steady state, a sustainable size, or it's going to overshoot its the scale at which it can be sustained long term. And I think we've already done that. We've far overshot the scale of economy that can be sustained long term. So we're almost certainly in for some decades of economic contraction. And what that means for the financial system is pretty scary, because debt just doesn't work in a contracting economy, because the payments that have to be made on existing debt with interest are proportionally larger and larger as the overall size of the economy shrinks. And so most of that debt is ultimately defaulted upon. And so what that looks like, of course, is just massive bank runs and defaults and so on. And history has seen these events repeatedly. It's not like, we didn't invent debt in the 20th century. It's been with us for thousands of years, and people have misused debt repeatedly throughout history, and we've seen the results. But of course, now we're talking about a much, much bigger scale, because in past societies, early agrarian societies, most people didn't even use money. Most people worked on self-sufficient farms, and only had to use money to pay taxes or to buy a few things they couldn't grow on the farm. Now, over half the world's people are living in cities and dependent on a cash economy. So this could have unprecedented repercussions for real people. It's as big a problem as climate change or peak oil. The debt crisis is going to be a real time of reckoning for for the modern world in the 21st century.
Now, moving on to GDP, or gross domestic product, this is the insane measurement that we worship to examine our economic progress, along with equilibrium theory and some childish theories. It's a childish theory, I think, but I think GDP is a really bad indicator because it doesn't take into consideration things like inflation, and it also takes into consideration bad costs like military and jail expenses, alcohol consumption, etc. So, Richard, can you tell our audience your views on both GDP and GPI?
Right. Well, GDP is basically an indicator of how much money is flowing through the economy, and it's a pretty good proxy of consumption rates. If GDP is going up, then we're using more oil, more iron ore, more cement, concrete, and so on, generally speaking. So what we're looking at in the future is a world of lower energy availability and lower consumption. So if GDP is our sole index of economic success, as it is currently, then the future is going to look very bad, because GDP is going to be going down if it's measured honestly. Of course, that's a different question. I think GDP is not being measured honestly, especially in China. But nevertheless, it's, as you say, it's not a good indicator because it doesn't separate the economic goods from the economic bads. We spend a lot of money on things that, we'd be better off not spending it on, but that's not captured by GDP. If you have a natural disaster and you have to rebuild a city, that looks good for GDP, but, do we therefore pray for more natural disasters? Of course, that would be crazy. So there have been alternatives proposed to GDP, including the GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicator, gross national happiness, which is used by the nation of Bhutan, and I was very happy to be invited to a committee to advise the nation of Bhutan in its efforts to convince the United Nations to adopt gross national happiness, or GNH, as at least a complement to GDP. So those are at least a couple of alternatives that are out there, and I think there's more and more interest in them as policymakers are realizing that we're not in the same kind of economy as we were in the 20th century. During the 20th century, we saw lots of GDP economic growth, GDP measured economic growth, especially the latter part of the 20th century. And that became the new normal. All policymakers decided that's what we should expect from here on till kingdom come. It's easy to understand why, because it was so easy to get used to. It was this self-reinforcing good times. With more GDP growth, there were higher tax revenues, and with more tax revenues, you could fund more programs that benefited more people, and people liked that, and they voted for the politicians who promised more GDP growth, and it was like this unending gravy train. It's harder to get used to economic shrinkage, GDP decline. It spells trouble for banks and pension funds and all kinds of things, politicians, government revenues, all these things. But it's where we're headed. The evidence is very, very clear. If you look at the statements of some of our top global economists over the past 10 years or so, they're saying, hey, look, this is, they're calling it different things. They're calling it secular stagnation. Well, what does that really mean? It basically means economic growth is stopping. So how do we adapt to that? And adopting different economic indicators is one good thing we can do.
I'm interested to know, you would obviously say that we're not getting happier as a society, that we're not getting more prosperous, that we're going backwards now?
Well, yeah, I mean, as people experience fewer well-paying jobs, as they experience having to pay more for food, as they experience their communities and their nations becoming more economically unequal, that doesn't make them happy, right? So we are seeing declining levels of satisfaction in most industrial societies right now as the economy begins to seize up. But the antidote for that is for policymakers to begin to recognize what is it that actually does make people happy, and to start prioritizing those things instead of prioritizing the things that traditionally have led to more economic growth. Funneling more money to the banks, creating conditions for more economic bubbles. I mean, that could maybe give us another year or two of GDP growth. So that's what the central banks have been focusing on. They've just been shoveling money into the financial system, creating more bubbles. That's really what was responsible for the fracking bubble in the U.S. Just all trillions of dollars sloshing around the financial system, looking for the next big thing. And all that money, a lot of that money, got invested in North Dakota and Texas. But is that making people happy over the long term? No. What makes people happy is having enough to get by. First of all, people do need the basic physical means of existence. They need work that's satisfying. They need communities that are safe. They need a sense of belonging in their communities, a sense of civic engagement, cultural events that are fun and that people get to participate in. And a lot of those things actually don't cost very much. They cost a lot less than throwing trillions of dollars into the financial system and hoping that it'll keep the propellers running for another cycle. So if we start measuring and aiming for happiness rather than GDP growth, there's a lot we could do. Nevertheless, the reality is, of course, there are going to be a lot of unhappy people no matter what we do, given the kinds of constraints we're facing. But we can do this in the kind of stupid, clumsy way that will result in massive failure and human suffering, or we could do it in a way that is difficult and will entail a lot of sacrifice, but at the end of the day will leave us with much happier and more sustainable communities. And the latter course, to me, just obviously makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, I know what people are going to write in the comments of this video. They're going to say that the government's not interested in us being happy, that it's part of a conspiracy, it's a one world government, Rothschilds enslave us all and microchip us. What do you say to those people?
Yeah, I don't see some shadowy group behind everything. They have all the charts and graphs, and they understand where all of this is going. And there are a few very powerful people in the world, and by a few I mean maybe a few hundred people who are control billions of dollars each. I've met a few. Not many, but I've met a few billionaires. And, they tend to be pretty smart people to get to where they are, but they have their own blind spots, and they definitely have severe limits as to what they actually can control. I get it that, the Rothschilds were able to manipulate the countries of Europe during the 19th century and maybe have some control over some of the world's central banks and so on. Okay, yeah, but there are severe limits to what any of these groups are actually able to do and control. And there are severe limits in terms of their knowledge of how things are unfolding. I think they're, again, judging by my limited personal experience with conversations with billionaires. They're smart people, but they're no smarter than a number of other people that I know and talk to on a regular basis. And I think we're all in an unprecedented situation, and those of us who have the luxury and privilege, as I've had, of being able to spend basically full time following these trends and researching and writing about them, I think have a big responsibility to share that knowledge so that that more of us can see what's ahead and adapt. That's all any of us could do. There's no magic bullet here, and there's no shadowy group that controls everything. We're in an adaptive system, a chaotic adaptive system. And that can be pretty scary because ultimately nobody's in charge. But it's a system that we all have a stake in and that we can all influence to some degree.
Now, I want to move on to discussing with you the mindset of the average member of the public. I've had a lot of discussions with people over the years about peak oil, especially when I used to operate a national solar company. And from my experience, I can say that most people I've spoken with believe that peak oil is something that governments will have to solve and deal with, and ultimately most people think that some kind of magic technology will save us at the 11th hour. Now, this sort of thinking really frightens me because governments can't even decide on gay marriage or keep drugs out of jails. So, Richard, what do you say to people who have this kind of optimistic mindset?
Well, it's a psychological defense mechanism. It keeps people from having to face the fact that we live in a world that's out of control, and the folks in charge really don't know what they're doing. The people in government and the people in charge of the financial system are basically clueless. They're constantly being faced with new realities for which they are unprepared, and they're doing the best they can, but it's not good enough. So, some of the magic new technology. Look, I don't like being a pessimist. I would much prefer to be able to go to bed at night with the confidence of thinking that all these problems are going to be sorted out and the next generation is going to be fine and so on. But I don't see it. Looking at the facts, if a new energy technology that we don't know about today were to come along tomorrow, it would take us about 4 decades to get it through R&D and then the implementation phase so that it was actually producing a significant amount of commercial energy 40 years from now. We don't have 40 years. Peak oil is right around the corner. Climate change is happening right now. We have to run with what we have, and that's basically solar and wind and some biomass and geothermal and so on. And these are not energy sources that are going to enable us to maintain a consumer growth economy, such as we built over the course of the 20th century. So, we have a very different future in store for us, and it could be really, really bad, or it could be just really challenging, but it's not going to be easy. And the sooner we recognize that and start pitching in and doing what we can, the better off we'll be.
Now, one thing the public loves doing, Richard, is having sex and making babies. Probably more having sex and less babies these days because of the cost of living. But in all seriousness, having no population regulations is going to make the whole transition a whole lot more difficult. And I can't see how governments of the world can really legislate to impose any population controls, because the opposing political party will just wave their hands and say, hey, vote for us and we'll abolish population restrictions, just like we've seen in Australia with abolishing the carbon tax. So Richard, should we have population controls, and do you see any feasible way that this could actually be implemented?
Well, of course, population is a very sensitive topic. It hits people in a place that is very personal and meaningful to them. Nevertheless, the more people we have on the planet, the more difficult this transition is going to be. If you have a growing population in a shrinking economy, that means on a per capita basis you have a even worse situation. Whereas if you have a shrinking economy but a shrinking population, at least on a per capita basis, things aren't so bad. Japan's economy hasn't really been growing, but Japan's population is shrinking, and you look at the average lifestyle in Japan, it's not that bad. People are doing okay. And Japanese society is still pretty functional. But in countries that are still seeing very high fertility rates, most of those countries are poor countries, and unfortunately their policymakers are condemning future generations in those countries to very inhumane conditions. So, from a human welfare standpoint, population stabilization and reduction it should be a issue very, very high on the list of priorities. And of course, that means in these poorer countries that we're mostly talking about, increasing the levels of education for women, changing cultural norms so that people no longer see social status in terms of having a larger number of children, and that can be done. We work closely with an organization called Population Media Center that works in many countries around the world, including the United States, and works with local artists to produce sometimes radio, sometimes television shows, sort of like, and I don't mean like one-off documentaries about population, but I mean like soap operas, in which the masses of people, millions of people, get caught up in these soap operas. They don't want to miss an episode. But in the storylines of the soap operas, you have the characters, wrestling with these issues of education and how many children to have and abortion and all of these are really difficult issues to deal with, and the characters grapple with them in very realistic ways, and it's been shown that through subsequent studies that this is the most effective and cheapest way to reduce fertility. So, and there's one in the U.S. called East Los High, which actually won an Emmy just recently, and it's produced in Los Angeles.
Okay, so I don't want to sound too alarmist, Richard, but I think people need to open their minds and use their imaginations a little bit. If our society doesn't successfully deal with this issue, how do you think the government is likely to handle the problem? Would they build concentration camps and round us all up for termination, or hold some kind of culling lottery, or will we simply party until the final hour and 3 weeks later most of us will be dead? I mean, some people might be saying that I'm sounding extreme, but if you look at the Titanic, in the final hours, some staff were shooting passengers who were disrupting the orderly process of boarding life rafts. So benevolent behaviour quite easily disappears in a crisis. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think we'll see the whole spectrum of human behavior over the course of the next few decades. Crisis can bring out the best in people, and it can bring out the worst in people. There are plenty of historical precedents for both. So the question is, what do we do now? Do we set the stage for the best or the worst in human behavior? In many ways, I think we're setting the stage for, if not the worst, some pretty bad human behavior. And that's a matter of great concern. There are lots of press. If you look back at societies, what happens to societies in economic decline, you can find any kind of horror story you want to see. At the same time, there are some examples, at least, of people and their behavior in particularly, more often in short-term disaster settings, of just doing amazingly heroic things to not just to protect their own lives and their families, but total strangers, and banding together and sacrificing in extraordinary ways. Look back at what happened in World War II. Of course, there were horrific events going on in Germany and Europe and throughout much of the Pacific region, but there were also, people at home just sacrificing in extraordinary ways for the sake of the war effort, and growing vegetables in their lawns and recycling and pitching in ways that were, frankly, very uncomfortable, but, people were happy to do it because it was contributing to what they thought of as a noble cause. Well, we need a noble cause right now. We need a way of mobilizing people's best behavior around what will be very challenging situations. Now, one way to do that, of course, would be another world war, and that's a possibility. I think it's entirely possible that we will see some kind of major conflict emerge as a way of distracting people from economic decline, and a way of basically protecting governments from the backlash that would otherwise occur. During wartime, governments are able to prohibit criticism from their own people, and on the grounds of mobilizing more patriotism and so on. So that's one possibility, but it doesn't have to be that way. Again, my efforts have been to educate as many people as possible about what the future holds, so that we can see that there are better alternatives. There are other ways of mobilizing the best of human nature around challenging circumstances, and get started now to set up the circumstances so that crisis will bring out the best in us rather than the worst in us.
So in closing, Richard, do you have any other advice or any final thoughts for our audience?
I think we've covered a lot of territory in this interview, and some of it's very serious and frightening. It takes one a while to really deeply integrate this kind of information. If anybody was watching this interview and they weren't already aware of some of the things we were talking about, and the immediacy of them, I'm sure that this is all pretty frightening. Well, just realize that there are millions of other people around who are also aware of these things and are doing all they can to integrate the information in their lives and make their lives sensible in this context. So you have things like the Transition Town movement, the Transition Initiatives, and websites like my organization runs a website called resilience.org that publishes the news, as scary as it is, but also publishes a lot of material on a daily basis that is just practically helpful in terms of reorganizing your life in a way that makes sense, whether it's information about permaculture and local food, or renewable energy and community organizing and on all this stuff. So take that energy of fear and invest it in a way that will benefit you and your community and your family.
Make some videos and get the word out.
Sure.
And lastly, Richard, what have you been up to lately, and are you working on anything new and exciting?
Well, yeah, there's the book I mentioned earlier on renewable energy, Our Renewable Future, that's coming out. Well, we have the first copies out now, but I don't think the online outlets have it yet until I think early June 5th or something like that, goes on sale. And currently I'm working on a set of videos for secondary education and college level that can be used in sustainability classes, basically a lot of different classes that walk the viewer through the challenges of the 21st century that we've been talking about, and then look at community resilience, and in a very nuts and bolts, grassroots kind of way, how do you build community resilience? Because resilience is what we're going to need more of during this century. The ability to absorb shocks, bounce back, adapt, transform, and come out the other end, in a way that's recognizable and functional.
Fantastic. Well, that's a wrap up for this video. Remember, if you want to discover any of Richard's books, you can buy them from Amazon or in audio at audible.com. Richard Heinberg, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today, and good luck with all of your work.
Well, thanks. Good luck with your work too.
Thank you.